The bottle left his hand before anyone could stop him. It hit the wall above the bartender's head and exploded. Glass and whiskey raining down across the bar. The big man laughed, picked up another. Nobody in that saloon moved. Nobody ever moved. That was the rule in Broken Spur. 3 years that rule had held, then the doors swung open. A woman, widow's black, walked in. Past 60. Gray hair pinned tight. She didn't say stop. Didn't say anything. Just crossed the room at a walk. Slow, steady. Like she had all the time in the world, and the bottle in his hand meant nothing to her at all. 5 feet away. He raised it over his head, grinning, and swung, and her hand closed around his wrist. What happened in the next 4 seconds, nobody in that town would forget. Because the man on the floor was a Vance. The stagecoach rattled into Broken Spur on a Thursday afternoon, with 3 days of desert dust, caked into every crack, and a left rear wheel that squealed like something dying slowly. Nobody paid it much attention. Stages came through twice a week. Twice a week people looked up. Twice a week they looked back down again. Nothing ever changed in Broken Spur, until it did. She stepped down from the coach, and the first thing anyone noticed was the dress, black. The heavy kind, the kind that said widow and meant it. The second thing they noticed was her age, not young, not even close to young, somewhere past 60, with gray hair pinned back tight and a face that had been through weather. Not just sun and wind. The other kind. The kind that came from inside and worked its way out over years until it was just part of the landscape of a person. The third thing they noticed was her hands. They were shaking. Not a lot, just enough. Just enough that when she reached up to grip the door frame, stepping down, her fingers trembled against the painted wood. One woman on the general store porch leaned over to the woman beside her and whispered something. The other woman nodded. Neither of them looked away, because there wasn't much to look at in Broken Spur anymore. And a shaking old woman in a widow's dress was at least something different. Harriet Morse was the only person who walked toward the stage, 54 years old, solid as a fence post, gray-eyed and sharp-mouthed, and she'd buried a husband and kept a boarding house, running through 3 hard winters, and watched 3 lawmen come and go from this town in the past 3 years. She had decided a long time ago that surprise was a luxury she couldn't afford. So she'd stopped buying it. She stopped 3 feet from the woman in the black dress, didn't say hello, didn't say welcome, didn't say anything that cost more than the words required, just said, "The investigator before you left Monday night." Took his horse and his saddlebags and left his badge on the desk with a piece of paper that said sorry. Didn't even spell it right. The woman in the black dress looked at her, eyes the color of creek water in winter, pale, cold, still, giving nothing away and not apologizing for it. "Which direction did he ride?" she said. Harriet blinked. "West. Smart man." The woman reached back into the coach and pulled out a leather bag. Not heavy. Light enough that a good wind might carry it off. She set it on the boardwalk and straightened slowly, one hand pressed briefly to her lower back, not making a show of it, just acknowledging the fact. "I'm Nora Voss. I know who you are." "Good." Nora picked up the bag. "Then you can skip the part where you warn me." She started walking. Harriet stood there for a moment watching her go. Then she picked up her skirts and followed, because somebody had to. And because in 3 years of watching this town fold in on itself, Harriet Morse had learned that the people worth following were the ones who didn't wait to be followed. 28 years. That was how long Nora Voss had worn a federal badge. Long enough that she'd stopped thinking of it as a job somewhere around year 11. It just became the shape of her life, the rhythm of it. Wake up, find the wrong, fix it. Try not to get killed. Come home to Thomas. Stop. Don't. Not yet. She walked the length of Main Street and didn't look like she was doing anything except walking. But she was reading. That was the thing about 28 years. You learn to read a town the way other people read a newspaper. Faster than a newspaper, actually. And more honest. Towns didn't know how to lie the way people did. They just showed you 8 men visible on the street, 4 of them wearing guns low and forward. Not ranch hands. Ranch hands wore guns differently, higher, more casual. The way you carried a tool you used every day and didn't need to think about. These 4 wore guns, the way you wore something you intended to use soon. The way you wore a decision you'd already made. 2 of them were watching her, the other 2 were pretending not to. The general store had bars on the lower windows. New bars recently installed, not yet weathered to the same gray as the wood behind them. The livery stable had a lock on the paddock gate that cost more than most families in a town this size made in a month. The church at the far end of the street had boards over 2 of its windows, not from disrepair. From impact, someone had thrown something through those windows. Maybe someone had been thrown. The boards had gone up because the glass wasn't replaced, because nobody expected it to be safe enough to bother replacing. The investigator's office sat at the far end of the street past the church, door hanging slightly open, not in one, welcome, in the way of things that had given up on the idea of being properly closed. Like they'd just stopped trying one day and nobody had gotten around to arguing about it. Nora stopped in front of it, looked at the door. Then she went inside. It smelled like mice and old paper and something else underneath. Something metallic and familiar that she didn't want to name just yet. She stood in the doorway until her eyes adjusted to the dim. Then she walked to the window and pulled the boards loose one by one. The nails came out of the soft wood with a sound like small surrenders. Each one, pull, squeal. Done by the time she finished, her hands had stopped shaking. They always did. Eventually, the office had a desk on its side, a broken chair, an empty gun rack on the wall, a cell in the back corner with a door that swung open on hinges, rusted into permanent surrender. Not so different from 3 other offices she'd walked into over the years. Different territories. Same story. Same smell underneath everything. Same feeling of a place that had been given up on by the people who were supposed to be responsible for it. She righted the desk. Found the chair wasn't broken, just knocked over, hard enough that a leg had split from the seat. Fixable, she set it aside. Went back outside, found the nearest building with a porch, borrowed one of its chairs and carried it back. Left a note on the porch that said she'd borrowed it. She was fairly sure the note would confuse people more than the missing chair. Back inside, she opened her leather bag and took out what she'd brought. Paper, pen, ink, 1 good lamp, oil for the lamp, a packet of ground coffee and a battered tin pot that had survived things she preferred not to think about. A folded cloth she used for everything, dusting, bandaging, whatever the day required. A book she'd been reading for 6 months without finishing because the days kept interrupting. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of chamois leather, the badge. She didn't take the badge out yet, because there was something she needed to sit with first. Something she'd been not thinking about since Abilene, where a man from the territorial office had explained to her very carefully that the Federal Service had no active record of her commission and hadn't had one for 14 months. If she wanted to reactivate it, she'd need to go to the Capitol. File the correct paperwork, in the correct sequence, with the correct signatures from the correct people who sat in the correct chairs. She'd said she understood. She'd ridden south instead of east. So here she was. One woman in a black dress with a badge that was technically a piece of metal attached to nothing. No legal authority, no official standing. 20 days, maybe 20 days, the estimate was imprecise, before the actual authorized federal investigator arrived and either fixed things or decided they couldn't be fixed. 20 days. Right. She put the lamp on the desk, lit it, and went back to cleaning. Harriet Morse arrived at dusk with a plate of food and the expression of a woman doing this under protest who intended to deny it later. "You haven't eaten," she said. "Set the plate on the desk. You don't know that." "I know what I can see." Harriet sat down without being invited, in the borrowed chair, as if she'd already decided it was hers. "Eggs and bread. Don't argue with me about it. Nora looked at the plate. Then she picked up the fork. "You going to stay?" Harriet asked. "I haven't left yet. The last 3 investigators did. Left real quick, 2 of them. One stayed almost a week. What happened to the one who stayed a week?" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "He left too, but he left slower and he looked different going than he did coming in." Nora chewed. Swallowed. "The Vance family. That's who runs things. Not a question. Not really." The answer had been written in every building on that street. In every downcast eye she'd passed. In every door that opened just enough for someone to look out and then swung shut again before she could see their face. How long? 3 years, give or take. It was slow at first. "Ruth Vance, she's the oldest. She's the one you need to understand. She doesn't do things fast. She does them right. Every piece of land they acquired, they paid for. Not fairly, but legally. Every agreement they made, they wrote down. She has a lawyer in the Capitol with very good paper." Harriet paused, folded her hands in her lap. "They own the water rights to the main creek, the 2 largest cattle operations in the valley, the freight company, the mill, the saloon. What don't they own? My boarding house," a pause that had weight behind it. So far, Nora ate. The eggs were good. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until she started. "Tell me about the brothers," she said. "Cord is the middle one. He's the muscle. Big. Mean in a way that's personal rather than practical, like he enjoys it more than he needs it. He has particular difficulty with women who don't defer to him." Harriet's voice was flat, precise. The voice of someone who had spent 3 years studying something dangerous and wanted to be accurate about it. "Lyle is the youngest. He's the one to watch when you're not watching him. Cord comes at you straight. Lyle comes from the side, from behind. When you're busy with something else and think you know where everyone is. And Ruth?" Harriet was quiet for longer this time. "Ruth Vance built all of this from nothing," she said finally. "Their father died in someone else's mine when they were children. She raised those 2 boys herself, worked double jobs, taught herself law from books she borrowed, and never returned." The pause again. "The one that meant something. She's not a cruel woman. She's a determined one. There's a difference, but it gets hard to see after a while. What's security? Control. To never be the kind of powerless she was as a child." Charlotte. Harriet stood, took her chair back toward the door with the confidence of ownership. "What she's built is the thing she was afraid of when she was 12 years old. She just can't see it from the inside." Nora looked up at her. "You've thought about this a great deal. I've had 3 years and not much else to do." Harriet stopped at the door. "Breakfast is at 6. I don't hold it for late risers." She left. Nora sat alone in the lamplit office and finished her eggs and thought about determined women and the things they built and the things those things became when nobody was watching carefully enough. The next morning she was at her desk with the second cup of coffee when the door opened. No knock. Doors in towns like this didn't knock. Not when the person opening them had enough claim on the place that knocking felt like a formality beneath them. Nora knew who it was before she looked up. She'd been half expecting it. The only question had been which morning. The woman who walked in was 52 years old and carried herself like someone who had decided a long time ago that rooms belonged to her when she entered them. Not through aggression, through certainty, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it was simply assumed. Ruth Vance was not large. Medium height, slim, hair dark but threaded through with silver. Worn up in the way of women who had stopped caring what it looked like and started caring only that it stayed out of their way. Dressed in clothing that was practical and expensive, in the particular way that cost money to look effortless. She was carrying a folder. That was what Nora noticed first. Not the woman, the folder. Because folders meant paper. Paper meant legal. And legal, in Nora's experience, was almost always more dangerous than a gun. A gun could only shoot you once. Paper could follow you everywhere. Ruth sat down across from the desk as if she'd been invited, set the folder on the surface between them. Folded her hands on top of it. She said, I'm Ruth Vance. I know who you are, Nora said. A slight smile. I imagined you do. She opened the folder, turned it to face Nora. I'll be direct, Miss Voss. I prefer directness. It saves time. She slid 2 sheets of paper across the desk, official-looking, seals, signatures, the kind of formatting that costs from someone money to produce. Federal Investigator Commission, Article 7, Section 3. Territorial mandate requires active commission documentation to be presented to any jurisdiction within 30 days of appointment. The commission you held was not renewed 14 months ago. The standard renewal process. I know what the standard renewal process is. Requires physical presence at the Capitol office. Completed forms in triplicate, review by 2 senior commissioners, and final approval, which takes a minimum of 6 weeks. Ruth's voice was even, careful, not nervous. She didn't rehearse this because she was nervous. She rehearsed it because precision mattered to her. Because sloppy language led to sloppy outcomes, and she would build everything she had on the opposite principle. Your commission is not active, Ms. Voss. You have no legal authority to conduct investigations, make arrests, or seize property in Broken Spur or anywhere else in this territory. Silence. Nora read the papers. All the way through, both pages. They were correct. She'd known they would be. That was the thing about Ruth Vance. Harriet had told her enough. The folder had told her the rest. This woman did not come to fights. She wasn't certain she'd already won on paper. The authorized investigator, Ruth continued, is expected to arrive in approximately 20 days. At that time, any legitimate concerns about activity in Broken Spur can be formally addressed through appropriate channels. She closed the folder. In the meantime, you are of course welcome to remain in town as a private citizen. But I want to be very clear, and I hope you'll receive this in the spirit it's intended, which is courtesy, that any actions you take which purport to carry legal authority will be challenged, immediately, aggressively. Through the courts, she stood, picked up the folder. Welcome to Broken Spur, Ms. Voss. She left, same as she'd come in. Like the room was hers on the way out, too. Nora sat for a long time. She looked at her hands. They'd stopped shaking while Ruth was talking. She hadn't noticed until now. Interesting. Then she reached into her bag, took out the chamois leather, unwrapped it. The badge was tarnished, scratched. One corner had a dent from a close call in Tucson she preferred not to think about. It was, technically, a piece of metal attached to nothing, a symbol without current substance. An argument waiting to be lost in court. She pinned it to her dress, because here was what Ruth Vance, with all her folders and her precision and her correctly spelled legal arguments, had miscalculated. Power didn't come from paper. It came from whether people believed you or not. And belief wasn't a legal document. You couldn't file it or challenge it or argue it before a judge. It either existed or it didn't, and Nora intended to make Broken Spur believe. 20 days. She picked up her pen and started writing. She found the problem on day 3. Or rather, the problem found her. It announced itself the way problems in small towns usually did, loudly, without subtlety, with an audience assembled whether anyone wanted one or not. She was walking back from the dry goods store with her supplies when she saw the horse, bay, gelding, tied not to the hitching post in front of Callum Pratt's general store but directly to the door handle, blocking the entrance completely. A woman with a basket on her arm stood on the boardwalk, looking at the horse, looking at the door, looking at the street, with the expression of someone who had encountered exactly this before and had learned that the correct response was to go home and come back later and say nothing about it to anyone. Nora stopped walking, looked at the horse, looked at the store, looked through the window where Callum Pratt stood behind his counter, watching with the particular helpless fury of a man who had learned that fury without power was worse than just being quiet. So he'd chosen quiet. He'd been choosing it for 3 years. It was getting heavier every day. She looked across the street, at the saloon, where, visible through the front window, a large man was drinking with 2 companions and not Currently, thinking about his horse at all, Cord Vance. She'd seen him twice, at a distance. Hadn't been formally introduced. She was about to fix that. She set her supplies down on the nearest porch, walked to the bay gelding, unhooked the reins from the door handle, and walked the horse to the hitching post 20 feet down the boardwalk. Looped the reins properly, checked they were secure. Then she walked into the saloon. The piano stopped playing. Conversations dropped like they'd been cut with a knife. Every head turned. She walked across the room at the pace she'd been using all morning. Not fast, not slow, not hesitant. The pace of someone who had decided where she was going and saw no reason to hurry or explain. She stopped at the corner table. Cord Vance looked up at her. Up close, he was larger than Dinst suggested. 6'2", maybe more. Shoulders built like a barn door, the kind of size that had probably settled most of his arguments for him since he was 16, without requiring anything else from him. He had his father's eyes probably, pale and flat and waiting for a reason to change. His companion's hands moved toward their belts. Casual, slow, not drawing, just reminding your horse, Nora said. Cord looked at her. Long moment. What about it? I moved it to the hitching post. He stared at her, then at his companions. One of them started to grin. You moved my horse. It was blocking the entrance to a place of business. Public obstruction. Town ordinance dating to the incorporation charter of 1871. Fine is $5. The grin spread. Someone at another table laughed. Quick cut off, but real. Cord's expression did something complicated. He wasn't used to being laughed at. It showed in the way his jaw tightened, and his eyes went flat and still. He stood up, very tall standing, looked down at her with the expression of a man deciding between amused and angry and landing. Somewhere in the middle, that was more dangerous than either. Old woman, he said, do you know who I am? Cord Vance. Middle child of the Vance family. 45 years old. You broke 2 of Jim Alderman's ribs in March. You put your fist through the window of this establishment in November, which is why there are new boards on the frame there. She indicated the window with a slight movement of her chin. You didn't pay for the glass. That's still outstanding. Silence. The kind with weight. $5 for the horse, Nora said. I'll note the outstanding glass repair separately. Or, you can keep your money and move the horse yourself next time. Either arrangement works for me. Cord looked at her. Really looked at her, taking in the black dress. And the gray hair. And the hands, the badge on her chest. And trying to assemble it into something that made sense and finding that it didn't quite fit any category he had available. He hawked and spat, not at her, near her. On the floor 6 inches to her left. Get out of my sight, he said. Nora looked at the spot on the floor, then up at him. I'll note the public health violation as well. She turned and walked back toward the doors. She heard his chair scrape back, hard. Heard him take 2 steps after her, and then she heard something else, someone near the door. She never saw who, never found out. Someone said very quietly, just let her go, Cord. He stopped. She didn't look back, kept walking. Through the doors and into the afternoon light where the bay gelding stood at the proper hitching post. And the woman was Callum Pratt's store, and Callum Pratt was standing in the open doorway with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. Gratitude, maybe, or terror on her behalf. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. She'd learned that early. She picked up her supplies and walked back to the office. Inside, alone, she sat down and let herself breathe. Let the cold in her chest. The old familiar cold. The one that settled in before those moments and stayed until they were over. Let it melt back out again. Her hands were shaking again. That was fine. That was exactly how it worked. Before and after. Never during. The body was very precise about that. It was been. She picked up her pen. She still had 17 days. She didn't intend to waste the afternoon of them. That night, August Briggs came to her office. Not alone. August was 59, built by decades at the forge, with a face like weathered rock and hands that could shape iron, and a stillness about him that she'd recognized immediately. Military stillness. The kind that didn't leave. 7th Infantry. He told her, when she said so. 3 years. 2 more after, as a Scout Montana Territory. He put a map on her desk, hand-drawn, detailed in the way that said someone had been watching carefully for a long time and down everything they saw. Every road into the valley, every trail through the hills, the Vance patrol routes in red pencil, times frequencies, how many riders, the weak points marked with small careful X's, the water routes, the high ground positions with clear sight lines to Main Street. How long did this take? She asked. 6 weeks. Since the second investigator left. Figured the third might be different. What made you think that? He looked at her steadily. Woman your age, wearing widow's black, comes into a town like this instead of away from it. She's either different or she's got nothing left to lose. And if it's the second one, at least she's going in the right direction. Behind him stood West Shaw, 22 years old. The kind of face still finding what it was going to be in another decade. Hat in his hands, turning it. He set it down on the chair near the door, like someone making a decision. I want to help. He's whatever the plan is. I can ride. I can shoot. I'm faster than I look, and I pay more attention than most people give free credit for. Nora looked at him. You're 22, she said. Yes, ma'am. Why? He blinked, then thought about it. Actually thought. Didn't just reach for the first answer, because I grew up watching people look at the floor. When certain people walked by, he said, my whole life in this town, I watched people learn to do it, and I've been doing it too. And I hate it every single time. He stopped, steadied himself. If I leave now, I'm just going to do the same thing somewhere else. Look at the floor somewhere else. Nora studied him. Can you actually shoot? She said. Yes, ma'am. Tomorrow morning, behind the livery. Bring what you're carrying. We'll see if it matches what you just said. He picked up his hat, tried not to look relieved, mostly managed it. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm going to work you hard and pay you nothing, I know, he said. And then, with the specific boldness of young men who'd just committed to something that frightened them and were running on the momentum of the decision. But I'll be looking at the ceiling when I do it. He left. August looked at her from the doorway. You're going to train them, witnesses, she said. Organized ones. With weapons. He nodded slowly. Like something he'd been waiting 6 weeks to hear had just been said. How many do you need? However many aren't afraid. That might be a short list in this town. It only needs to be long enough. She looked at the map. At the red pencil markings and the careful X's. August. The patrol gaps between 10 and midnight on the east side. Yes, start tonight. Just watching. Just counting. He picked up his hat. I'll start tonight, he went. She sat alone with the map, and her coffee gone cold in the quiet of broken spur settling around the walls. She could hear the saloon from here. Voices, music. The sounds of a town pretending everything was normal. 17 days. She picked up her pen. He came back on day 4, Lyle Vance. Not Cord. She'd been expecting. The direct one always made 2 visits, one to assess, one to act. She'd been positioning for him. Lyle she hadn't been watching for. Which was, she reflected, exactly how he preferred things. She was walking back from the farriers when she heard it. Not the usual saloon noise. Daytime noise. The particular sound of things breaking that weren't supposed to break. Glass. She went through the doors and found Lyle Vance at the bar, with 3 men who worked the Vance operation. The bartender backed against the shelves, with his hands raised, and his face the color of old flour. 3 broken bottles on the floor, whiskey pooling between the boards. Lyle was drunk. Not all the falling down kind, the worst kind, the kind that made certain men feel invincible and hilarious and completely untouchable. He had another bottle in his hand, and he was tossing it up and catching it with the grin of someone who had already decided how this afternoon was going to go. He threw it at the wall. It exploded. The bartender flinched so hard he nearly fell. Nora walked in. She didn't announce herself. Didn't say stop. Didn't say anything. just walked across the room that had gone entirely still, everyone frozen in the particular paralysis of people calculating whether getting involved cost more than staying out of it. The answer in Broken Spur for 3 years had always been, costs more, stay out. Lyle turned when she was 5 feet away. He grinned. The mean kind. The kind that never reached his eyes, because whatever lived behind his eyes didn't have any interest in smiling. The old woman who moved my brother's horse. He picked up another bottle off the bar, tossed it, caught it. Come to lecture me too? Put the bottle down, Nora said. Or what? 3 feet now. He laughed and raised the bottle. She moved, 4 seconds. 5 at most. She caught his throwing arm at the wrist, used his own forward momentum to pull him past her, hooked her right foot behind his left ankle, and applied a very specific kind of pressure to the arm she was holding. The kind that gave a man a clear choice between going down voluntarily or going down because the joint had run out of other options. Lyle Vance, 39 years old, significantly larger than her in every dimension that usually mattered, went down voluntarily, which was the correct choice. He hit the floor face first. She had his arm locked behind him before he finished landing, knee in the small of his back. Her weight distributed exactly where it needed to be. The saloon was completely quiet. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The bartender's hands were still raised, but his expression had changed into something entirely different. You assaulted a federal officer, Nora said. Her voice was easy, conversational, like she was discussing the weather to someone she'd just met. 6 months minimum, pending trial. Lyle tried to move. She applied a small additional pressure to the arm. He stopped. I'm going to let you up, she said, and you're going to sit in that chair over there until you're sober enough to walk without assistance. Then you're going to go home. You're going to stay there tonight. This is the one time I'm going to be this generous about it. Are we clear? Silence. Clear, Lyle said, through his teeth. Like the word cost him something he needed for other things. She let him up. He sat in the chair she'd indicated. His men looked at each other and found they had no agreed-upon response to what they'd just watched. So they didn't respond at all. Nora walked to the bar. How much for the bottles? The bartender stared at her, blinked twice. $3.50. She put $4 on the bar. Keep the change. She looked at the room. Evening, gentlemen. She went out. Outside, she walked exactly 12 paces before stopping, leaning against the building wall, and closing her eyes for 10 seconds, because she was 61 years old, and that had hurt. More than it would have at 30. More than at 45. Every joint and every muscle had an opinion about what she'd just asked them to do, and they were all expressing it simultaneously. They could express it all they wanted. She'd listen later. She pushed off the wall and kept walking. Behind her, she heard the saloon door. Several people start talking at once in a room that had been holding its breath for 3 years and just decided to try exhaling. Day 6 came in with fog, not the kind that burned off by 9, the staying kind. The kind that settled into the valley like it had made an appointment and intended to keep it. Broken Spur looked like a photograph of itself, all shapes and no edges. Buildings fading into gray at 30 feet, mountains entirely gone. The world narrowed down to one street and whatever you could see standing in the middle of it. Nora liked fog. She had always liked fog, because fog meant other people couldn't see clearly either. And she had spent 28 years turning disadvantages into uses. West Shaw appeared out of the gray at 6:15. On time, which told her things about him that he probably didn't know she was noting. Ready, he said. For what? He blinked. Training. No training today. She spread the map on the desk. You watch. That's all. I need eyes on the freight depot from 7 to noon. Who comes in, who goes out, what they're carrying, what direction they arrived from. Don't speak to anyone. Don't get noticed. Can you do that? He looked at the map, thought about it. There's a hayloft in the building, across from the depot. East window overlooks the whole yard. Good. She handed him a notebook. Write everything down. He took it. Went. By day 8, she had something that wasn't an army and wasn't a militia and wasn't quite a neighborhood watch and was best described as an organized inconvenience. 14 people, not fighters. People who had decided that some things mattered more than the comfortable misery of staying down. August ran the morning sessions behind the livery. Not target practice. Coordination. Communication. Knowing what the person beside you was going to do before they did it. The things that turned individuals into something that worked. He placed people and explained why quietly, like the reasoning mattered more than the instruction. Because it did. People who understood why held positions longer than people who were just following orders. West was the fastest learner. The pull-left problem corrected by day 7. One piece of advice about breath control, absorbed overnight column Pratt was the revelation. The nervous man with the apologetic posture, who had spent 3 years learning to look at the floor. Put a rifle in his hands and give him a clear sight line and a stationary position, and he went somewhere entirely different. Some people were like that. They needed the right conditions to become something they already were. Harriet didn't train. She moved through the town the way she'd always moved. Quietly, naturally, without seeming to notice the things she was very much noticing. Who spoke to whom when the Vance riders changed routes? What arrived on the freight wagons after dark? She had a network of information built over 3 years of watching and listening, and she opened it up to Nora like a woman, unlocking a room she'd been keeping for the right person. 3 pieces of it were about to become very important. The first piece came on day 9 mid-morning. She was at her desks when she heard the groan of old timber under sudden stress, then voices. Then, the specific smell of new smoke column Pratt's grain storage. Fire in one corner, small still, but moving she ran. West came from the east, August from the forge, 2 others from wherever they'd been, and already running. Nora was thinking past the fire to the thing that mattered more, because fires didn't start themselves. And Lyle Vance was standing at the end of the adjacent alley with 2 men, watching, wearing the expression of someone enjoying the consequence of something they'd arranged. They put the fire out. 40 minutes. A bucket brigade in the organized chaos that looked chaotic but wasn't quite, because August was directing positions, and West was managing the water supply, and Harriet had appeared from somewhere with wet blankets for the wall closest to spreading. When it was over, Callum Pratt stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the scorched corner of his building. "How bad?" Nora said. "Quarter of what's in there." His voice was flat, a man doing arithmetic in his head. "I'll manage. You shouldn't have to." "No," he looked at her. "But I have been." She turned to West, said one word, "notebook." For the next hour, she interviewed every person who had been anywhere near that alley in the past 2 hours. Names, times, positions, what they saw. West wrote it all down, precise. Times in the margin. 3 people had seen Lyle Vance in the alley before the fire started. 3 people with names and addresses and no criminal record reports. 3 people who, when Nora asked if they would sign their names to what they'd told her, looked at the floor and looked at each other and looked at her and said yes, all 3. She filed the statements, checked the lock on the jail cell, walked to the Vance house on the north end of Main Street, and knocked. Cord opened the door. "I need to speak to Lyle," she said. "He's not here. He will be." She held up the statements, fanned slightly, so he could see there were multiple pages. 3 witnessed accounts placing him at the origin point of the fire, at Callum Pratt's storage. 2 additional accounts of him making statements in the saloon about what would happen to the town's food supply if things didn't change. She lowered the papers. "I'll be at the office." "He has until sundown to come in voluntarily." She turned and walked back down the street. The door didn't close behind her for a long time. Cord came to the office first, with 5 men. The 5 men arranged themselves in the way meant to communicate something. She looked at their positions and found them slightly disappointing. August would have placed them differently. Cord stood in front of the desk. You can't arrest anybody. Ruth explained that. Lyle committed arson. 3 witnesses. That's a crime whether I have a commission or not. She set her pen down. Those witnesses exist regardless of my authority. Their statements exist. What I'm doing right now, she gestured at the papers, is building a record for the authorized investigator who arrives in 11 days. Every incident, every witness, every statement, preserved and ready. Cord stared at her. You're not arresting him. I'm asking him to come in voluntarily and answer questions. There's a difference, a pause. There's also a difference between right now. When this is a formal request, and 11 days from now, when the federal investigator arrives and finds a complete documented record of arson, with witnesses ready to testify. One of the 5 men shifted his weight. Cord noticed. Didn't like what it meant. Get out of this town, he said. I've heard that. She picked up her pen. I'll be here until sundown. Tell Lyle. He left without slamming the door. Men who left without slamming were angrier than men who did. Slamming was release. Not slamming was something building toward something else entirely. At 4 in the afternoon, Lyle Vance walked in, with 2 men behind him. But he walked in, which meant he'd thought about it. And thinking about it meant weighing options. And weighing options meant he wasn't as certain as he'd been that morning. They talked for 40 minutes. Nora asked questions. Lyle answered some, deflected others, lied about 2 things she could identify and noted them both without reacting. He signed nothing. She didn't ask him to. When he left, he looked at her from the doorway. You think this matters? It will, she said. West, in the corner with his notebook the whole time, looked at her after Lyle went. What now? We wait for Cord to decide what to do about it. She looked at the signed statements, the desk, and we make sure those 3 witnesses are somewhere safe tonight. West was already moving. Good kid. Day 11, the second piece from Harriet's network. She came to the office at 7 with coffee, and the expression of someone carrying news they hadn't settled on how to deliver. Judge Bell is here, she said. Nora looked up from her desk. He's not due for 9 more days. He arrived last night. Late freight wagon, instead of the stage. Harriet set the coffee down, held onto the cup a moment longer than necessary. He's staying at my place, I know. She'd heard him arrive, noted the time, waited to see where he went first. Who did he speak to last night? Harriet looked at her steadily. He walked to the north end of town and back. About 20 minutes. It was dark. North end of town. Where the Vance house was. Nora picked up her coffee. Send him to me when he's finished breakfast. Judge Orson Bell was 64 and had the look of a man who had spent those years making decisions that didn't always feel good and had learned to live with it the way you lived with weather. You didn't pretend it wasn't raining. You kept moving. He had white hair and careful eyes, and the posture of someone who knew how roomies when he walked into them and had stopped finding it comfortable. He sat down across from her desk, no folder, which told her something. You know why I'm here, he said. Tell me anyway. So we're both clear. He looked at his hands on the table. A man choosing words the way you chose footing on uncertain ground. I have a financial obligation to the Vance family. A loan. Legal documented 4 years old. Principal plus interest outstanding, he looked up. I cannot adjudicate any matter involving them while that obligation exists, professionally and ethically. How much? Nora said, Miss Voss. How much is the loan? He told her. She sat with that number and what it meant. 4 years ago, Ruth Vance making a loan to a circuit judge. Not a bribe. A loan. Legal documented. Callable. Building something she might need. The way you dug a well before the drought came. The way she did everything. I have no choice. Ethically. I know you don't. She did know. He was right. Which made it worse. When's the next available judge? 4 weeks. Minimum. Possibly 6. 4 weeks. After the authorized investigator arrived. After whatever the Vances decided to do in the space this created. Lyle Vance, she said. I have him on arson. 3 witnesses. He came in voluntarily. Bell looked at her. Without your active commission, any arrest. I know. Challengeable in a week. So he walks. Unless the authorized investigator, 9 days. Yes. She nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me directly. He stood, paused. Didn't quite look at her, Miss Voss. The record you're building. The witness statements. The incident reports. He stopped. Keep building it. Whoever comes after you will have something to work with. He left. She sat. She looked at the bottle in her desk drawer. She'd put it there on day one. Not because she intended to use it. Because she'd learned a long time ago that not having a thing nearby was not the same as not wanting it. The wanting needed to be looked at honestly. Hidden from. It got bigger in the dark. She took the bottle out, set it on the desk. 14 months. 14 months since the last drink. Before that, 2 years of the other kind. 2 years of drinking because Thomas was dead and she had led the operation that killed him. And there had to be something to put between herself and that fact. That specific fact. The one that lived in her chest like a coal that never cooled. She'd stopped 14 months ago. Not because she felt better. Because she'd looked in a mirror one morning. In a boarding house in Prescott and hadn't recognized the woman looking back. And she'd thought, Thomas would not recognize you either. She'd poured the bottle out, started walking. Ended up here. She looked at the bottle on the desk, picked it up, walked to the window, opened it, poured the whiskey out into the dirt below, slow and steady, watched it darken the dust. Put the empty bottle on the window where she could see it, because the empty bottle was the right kind of reminder, not what was in it. What wasn't? Her hands were shaking. That was fine. She went back to her desk and wrote Lyle Vance's name at the top of a fresh page and documented everything she still could. He walked out at noon. She watched from the window, Lyle Vance. Free, hands loose at his sides. That mean grin, 2 men behind him, walking down Main Street like he owned it. Because today, technically he did. West came in 30 seconds after. His jaw was tight, in the way of young men who hadn't yet learned to spread anger from usefulness. They would learn. It took time. What do we do? He said. We keep building the record. She didn't look away from the window. Every incident from now until the investigator arrives. We document everything. And meanwhile he does what he does. And we document that too. You're not going to... He stopped himself. Took a breath. People are scared. The Hendersons, the families on the East Side. They've been waiting for something to actually happen, and now. West, she waited until he looked at her. I know, and I need you to understand something. She leaned forward. The moment I do something outside the law to fix what the law failed to fix, I become the same thing they are. Someone who decided their way mattered more than the system. And the system, broken as it is, slow as it gets, wrong as it sometimes turns out, is the only thing standing between people like the Vances and people who have nothing at all. She paused. You fight this the right way, or you don't fight it at all. He was quiet. That's hard, he said. It's the hardest thing there is, harder than the shooting. She sat back. Go tell Mrs. Henderson I'm coming by this afternoon. I want her to keep organizing. What we're building doesn't stop. Because Lyle walked out a door, he went. She sat alone and didn't let herself think about how much she wanted to walk down that street and do something direct and immediate and satisfying. She was 61 years old. She'd had a lot of practice not doing the satisfying thing. Day 13. Evening rounds. She'd been doing her own version of rounds, walking slowly, seeing things. Occasionally stopping to speak with someone who looked like they needed speaking to when she realized she was being followed, not Cord's men. They followed, obviously, deliberately. As a message, this was careful. She turned into the alley beside the dry goods store and waited. Ruth Vance came around the corner 45 seconds later, alone. No folder, no coat, buttoned right, her hair down from its usual arrangement, loose, in a way that said she'd dressed in a hurry or in the dark, and something in her expression that Nora had not seen on this woman's face before. Something that looked like exhaustion. The deep kind, the kind you couldn't fake. No one followed me, Ruth said. I know, Nora had checked. What do you want? Ruth looked at her. The night was cold. Their breath made small clouds between them. I want to tell you something, Ruth said, and I want you to understand that I'm not asking you for anything. Nora waited. Ruth looked away, down the alley, at something in the middle distance that wasn't there. My father died in a mine collapse when I was 11 years old. There were 12 men paid $50 to each family and called it an act of God. A pause. I had two younger brothers, no money, and nobody who was going to help us, because that was the world we lived in, and those were the rules. She looked back at Nora. I learned the rules. All of them, which ones could be used and which ones could be worked around. Another pause. Everything we built here, I built legally. Every piece I know, Nora said, then you know. I know the difference between legal and right. And so do you. Ruth was quiet. Cord and Lyle, she said finally. They've been mine to manage since they were children. I raised them. Somewhere she stopped. Somewhere they became something I was managing instead of something I built. I can't. Another stop. They're planning something. Before the end of the week. I don't know the specifics. Cord keeps me out now when it matters. A pause. I'm not telling you this to ask you for anything. I'm telling you so you're not standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Why? Nora said. Ruth looked at her. Like the question was one she'd been working toward an answer for a long time and wasn't quite finished with yet. Because I've done a great many things I'm not proud of, she said. But I don't want your death on the list. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. Steady, careful, alone. Nora stood in the alley for a long time after Ruth disappeared. Ruth Vance, who had built an empire from nothing, who had done it, legally, who had watched it curdle into something she no longer controlled, coming to warn the woman trying to dismantle it. Not from guilt, not quite. From the last working piece of something she used to be, Nora filed it all away. The words, the tone, the timing. Ruth had started to say and then hadn't. Then, she went back to the office and started thinking about the end of the week. She called a meeting on day 14. By 8 in the evening, 15 people were in the office. The overflow standing in the doorway. And on the nearest section of boardwalk, the window left open so everyone could hear. She told them directly, there's going to be an action before the week is out. I don't have specifics. What I know is that the Vances are moving from pressure to something more direct, and I want us ready. She looked around the room. August, steady face. West, alert. Callum Pratt with his rifle and his new stillness. Harriet, Bess, Henderson with practical eyes and permanent fury. The rancher from the east side. The two brothers from the feed operation. The teacher who had asked quietly to be included. We have 7 days until the authorized investigator arrives. We need to still be standing at the end of them. What if they come at night? That's what the watch rotation is for. She nodded at August, who ran through it briefly. Positions, shifts. The church bell is alarm. There are 20-some riders at the Vance operation. We counted 14 today. I know the numbers, Nora said. Numbers aren't the only thing that matters. Silence. The skeptical kind, they have more men, she said. We have more reasons. In a fight that comes down to who holds longer. That's everything. She paused. But understand what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to die. I'm asking you to stand, to be visible, to make it clear that whatever they bringing, this town is here, and it knows what it's doing. The moment they calculate the cost and decide it's too high, it's over, and if they don't decide it's too high, West asked. She looked at him. Then we make it higher. The meeting broke up slowly. When it was just August and West and Harriet left, August said what she'd been waiting for him to say. Tomorrow night, he said, or the night after. That's my read. Mine too. We'll be ready. She looked at the three of them. Get some sleep. All of you. They went. She sat alone. The empty bottle on the windowsill. She looked at it in the lamplight. The honesty of it. Nothing left to offer. Nothing left to pretend. She pressed her palms flat on the desk. 6 days, Thomas. She didn't say it out loud anymore, just thought it. The way you thought things you couldn't say to anyone else. 6 days. Either this, or it doesn't. Either this holds or it doesn't. Either these people find out they were right to stand up, or they find out they paid for someone else's wrong calculation. Her hands were still. She kept them on the desk anyway. The shaking wasn't weakness. It was the body telling you it knew the stakes, that it understood exactly what it was carrying. The shaking was just the price, and she had always been willing to pay prices. Day 15. West came in at 6 with his notebook and the look of a man who had been awake well before dawn. Cord was at the freight depot before sunrise, he said. At least 15 horses came in last night from the north. Not local men. Different tack. Different way of sitting a horse. Hired. She'd expected it. Had told August to watch for it 5 days ago, which means tonight, she said. Or before. August knows. I went to the forge first. Good. Right order. She looked at the morning light coming through the window. Clear day. The fog finally gone. Every detail sharp and present. That was how it always worked. The fog stayed until it wasn't needed. Then it left, and everything was visible and specific, and there was no more hiding from what was coming. She picked up the badge from where she'd left it on the desk the night before. Scratched and tarnished, and technically nothing more than a piece of metal. She pinned it on. Send the signal to August. Tell him to start bringing people in. West was already at the door. West. He stopped. You did well, she said. These past 2 weeks. You did well. He looked at her with the expression of someone who hadn't expected to be told that, and didn't know what to do with it yet. I had a good teacher, he said. He went. She stood at the window. Looked at Broken Spur in the clear morning light. Callum Pratt's store, opening its shutters. The fiddle player from the saloon crossing the street, heading home from a long night, coat collar up against the cold. Harriet Morse in the doorway of the boarding house with her. Coffee, watched with those sharp gray eyes that had never missed much and had been missing nothing for 3 years. 19 people, counting the farm families who come in from the valley edges last night. Against however many Cord Vance had paid to ride in from the north, the math wasn't great. The math, in her experience, was rarely the point. She took a breath. Let it out slow. Somewhere out there, Ruth Vance was in her house, on Othsen Arnoldtown, knowing something was coming today, and sitting with a choice she hadn't made yet. Somewhere out there, Lyle Vance was sharpening something, or loading something, or sitting somewhere, mean and small and certain. Somewhere out there, an authorized federal investigator was 6 days away, on a road heading north with paperwork that would mean everything if Broken Spur was still standing when he arrived. She had built the best thing she could build in the time she had, with the people she had, and the authority she technically didn't have, but had used anyway. Because sometimes that was what the moment required. Now she was going to find out if it was enough. The church bell was still. Broken Spur breathed in the morning light. Outside, August Briggs's hammer rang against iron, clear, steady once, then again. They came at dawn, not because dawn was dramatic, because dawn was practical. Low light, long shadows, the in-between hour when a body was at its worst, not quite awake, not quite sharp. Reflexes dragging behind the brain by just enough. Men like Cord Vance had learned that early and built habits around it. Except Broken Spur was already awake, had been awake since 2 in the morning, when August Briggs knocked 3 times at every door on the list, and people got up without complaint and moved to their positions in the dark. No lanterns, no noise. Just 19 people soliciting into the places they'd practiced for 2 weeks waiting. Nora stood in the middle of Main Street, in the dark. One woman in black, badge catching no light, because there was no light yet. And she waited. She heard them before she saw them, hoofbeats. A lot of them. Coming from the north at the pace of people who had stopped pretending. Past the point of pretending. This was announcement. This was force arriving at a town that was supposed to be sleeping. Except it wasn't sleeping. They came into the north end of Main Street like a tide. 22 riders. More maybe. Cord at the front. Some somewhere in the middle. She picked him out by posture, the slightly forward lean of someone always moving toward trouble. The hired men fanned out behind them, covering the width of the street and the near buildings. Professional. Organized. The kind of thing money bought when you wanted it done right. They stopped 40 feet from where Nora stood. The silence, after the hoofbeats, was its own kind of sound. Cord looked down at her from his horse, the empty street, the dark buildings. One woman standing in the road, with her hands at her sides. It looked like everything he'd expected to find here. He climbed down. This was personal enough that he wanted to do it on his feet. Last chance, he said. Walk away. Right now, get on a horse, and this is over. Nora looked at him. You burned Callum Pratt's storage, she said. You intimidated witnesses. You ran 3 investigators out of this town before me. A pause. And you're standing here at dawn with hired guns because you know that what I've built here for 2 weeks means you can't do it the easy way anymore. That's not the position of a man who has things under control, Cord. That's the position of a man who's scared. Cord's jaw tightened. Take her, he said. Anne Broken Spur woke up. Not all at once. Not the dramatic kind from stories. The real kind. Messy. Staggered. Imperfect. The kind that happened when people who weren't soldiers did something soldier-shaped. Because they decided they had to. West fired first. From the roof of the grain storage. A warning shot that took the hat off the nearest hired man without touching him. Excellent marksmanship, or the specific grace that descended on young people who had committed to something. Nora was willing to accept either. The hired man stopped moving. Which was the point? August stepped out of the forge doorway, and the firelight behind him made him enormous. Made him look like something from another time entirely. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He had a rifle and the muscle memory of a war that had never quite finished with him, and the 2 hired men who looked at him did the calculation fast. Callum Pratt had stood up from behind the water trough. Rifle up, hands not shaking. The stillness she'd seen in him on the range was there. Now. The conditions were exactly right, and Callum Pratt had found what had been there all along. The boarding house window went up. Harriet's voice. Clear as iron in the cold morning air. I have a clean shot at every man in the front row, and I am not a patient woman. Which was so precisely Harriet that Nora almost laughed. Almost. Because Cord was 20 feet away, and his hand was moving toward his gun, and his face had gone past anger into the blank white place where men stopped calculating and just acted. And that was the most dangerous place of all. Don't, Nora said. He drew anyway. She moved. 28 years. It wasn't speed exactly. Not the mystical quickness of stories. Just that her body had done this enough times that it stopped asking her brain for permission. The brain was slow. Thought was slow. Reflex was the body remembering everything it had ever learned and doing it before doubt could arrive and find a way in. Her gun was in her hand. Cord's was too, 15 feet between them. Gray-pink, light of a dawn, just beginning to exist. Neither of them fired because of the math, and because something else was happening at the north end of the street. A single horse coming fast from the direction of the Vance property. Then stopping, hard right, at the edge of the standoff. Ruth Vance, not Nora's calculation, not her plan. Nothing she'd arranged or hoped for, or let herself believe might happen. Just Ruth, alone, on a gray horse, with her hair loose and her coat thrown on crooked, like she'd dressed in the dark, and her face showing something Nora had never seen on it, a decision being made, right now. In real time, Cord, her voice carried. Stop, Ruth, get out of. I said stop. This is done. She's done. We finish this now, and you are not finishing anything. Ruth rode forward. Into the space between Cord and Nora. Between the hired men and the people of Broken Spur in their doorways and on their rooftops and behind their cover. She put herself in the middle of it. On a horse. in the dawn light. "Put the gun down, Ruth. Put it down." The silence was its own kind of violence. Cord looked at his sister. Really looked at her. Like he was seeing something he'd been carefully not seeing for a long time. And the not seeing had finally run out. "They'll take everything," he said. And for that one moment he didn't sound like Cord Vance, who broke ribs and moved horses and told women to get out of his sight. He sounded like a man who was afraid, the old kind. The kind from before the money and the power and the hired men and all the habits he'd built to keep that fear from showing. "Ruth, they'll take everything we built, I know." Her voice was steady, but something underneath the steadiness, something that cost. "We did that to ourselves when we stopped being careful. When we started taking instead of building." She looked down at him. "Cord, it's done." Lyle moved from the middle of the pack, not toward Cord, not toward Ruth, toward Nora. Fast. The move of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment, the distraction of the siblings. Everyone watching them, his gun already, before anyone was looking at him. And Nora was watching Cord, and West was tracking Cord's hand, and August was watching the front row, and nobody was watching Lyle, because nobody thought he'd move, while his own family was. The shot came from above. West Shaw, roof of the grain storage, 50 feet, moving target. Dawn light, he hit Lyle's gun hand, not the gun, which was harder, which required something beyond ordinary skill. Maybe the specific grace that sometimes appeared in young people who had decided they were entirely willing. Lyle's gun hit the dirt. Lyle stood there, holding his hand, face gone white, eyes moving fast, looking for another angle, another way. The way he always looked, always moving towards some advantage, and not finding one, because the hired men had done the math, the real fight, not the shooting, the calculation. The moment when 22 men with guns looked at what was in front of them and decided whether the money was worth what this was going to cost, whether dying for Cord Vance's wounded pride was actually in their contract. It wasn't. It never had been. The first one lowered his weapon. Then the second. Then it moved through the group like something spilling. Not dramatic, just the inevitable physics of a decision. Spreading from person to person when the deciding was already done. Within 2 minutes, 22 guns were no longer pointed at anything. Cord looked at his men, at his sister, at the gun in his own hand. He looked at Nora. She was still holding hers. "Still as bedrock. It's over," she said quietly. "Put it down, Cord." His jaw worked. His hand was shaking now, not the morning kind, the other kind. The kind that came after the adrenaline peaked, and the body started asking if that had really been the plan and what they were supposed to do now. He holstered the gun. Not threw it down, holstered it, which was his version of surrender. Holstered was still a choice, and Cord Vance needed it to be a choice. She could live with that. She lowered her own weapon. The next 3 hours were the least cinematic she'd spent in 2 weeks, which was fine. The practical aftermath of something like this was not a story. It was paperwork and logistics and the sustained effort of people coming down from the acute who needed tasks so their hands had something to hold. West came down from the roof pale, the particular pale of someone whose body had done something their mind was still catching up to. "You hit the hand," she said. "I was aiming for the hand," he said. Then quieter. "Mostly is enough," he nodded. "Found Callum Pratt needing help with the hired men's horses, and they did that together, which was probably the right medicine for both of them. August had 4 of the hired guns secured against the livery wall. They sat there with the resigned expression of men already calculating whether they could afford legal representation. Cord walked into the jail cell himself, sat down on the cot, put his forearms on his knees and stared at the floor, like he'd been expecting that room for a while, and was almost relieved to finally be in it. She locked the door. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. Nothing needed saying right now. Lyle was at Harriet's kitchen table getting his hand seen to. Not badly damaged. Grazed, bone intact, more pain than injury. Harriet worked on it with the efficiency of someone who had been the nearest thing to a doctor in this town for more years than that was reasonable, and had stopped pretending to be surprised by anything she found on her table. Nora came in while Harriet was finishing the bandage. Lyle looked up. "Where am I going?" he said. "Not quite a question, Sel. Next to your brother. For how long? Until the authorized investigator arrives." 6 days. She looked at him steadily. "I've sent 3 notices. Southern District Office, Eastern Office, the Territorial Governor. Your name, description, what you're being held for. If you were considering leaving, I'm not," he said, which surprised her. She let it show. Lyle looked down at his bandaged hand. "I'm tired," he said, and he sounded it. The mean energy, the forward lean, the always moving toward trouble quality, was simply gone, like it had been running on something that had finally run out. "I've been tired for a long time." A pause. "Ruth knows where all the records are, the land transfers, the freight contracts, the water rights documentation. She'll tell you." "Why?" Nora said. He shrugged. "Small. Because she built it, not me. Not Cord. Her." He looked at his hand. "Back in that alley this morning. I saw it on her face when she rode in." He almost smiled. Strange thing on his face. A guest that hadn't visited in years. She was always the smart one. Harriet met Nora's eyes over Lyle's head. Nora went to find Ruth. She found her at the north end of Main Street, standing with her horse, not moving toward the Vance house, and not moving away from it. Standing in the space between. The morning was fully up now. Clear light pulling long shadows westward. Broken spur, visible in its worn, imperfect, bullet hole and boarded window reality. Nora stopped a few feet away. "Lyle, so you know where the records are," she said. "I do. Will you show me?" Not quite a question. Ruth heard that. "Yes." She paused. "All of it. Land transfers, freight agreements, water rights. Some of it is legitimately ours. Properly purchased, properly documented." She finally looked at Nora. "I want that distinguished. The things we bought fairly, I want that on the record. Not for me. For what comes after, I'll note it. The rest." Ruth exhaled. "The Henderson land. The Pratt freight contracts. The creek access we rerouted in year 2. Those were taken. I know the difference. I know you do." Ruth looked at her. "You're not angry. I'm many things," Nora said. "Angry is somewhere on the list." A pause. "But you rode into that this morning. You put yourself between your brother's gun, and don't make it more than it was. What was it?" Ruth was quiet a long time. The horse shifted beside her, and she put one hand on its neck. The automatic comfort of something done 10,000 times. "It was the only thing left that was still mine," she said finally. "Everything else, the land, the money, the operations, that became something else. Somewhere along the way, something I built to survive, turning into something that was just consuming. Consuming everything around it and then consuming itself." She looked at Main Street. At Callum Pratt's store with its shutters open. At Harriet's lamp burning in the boarding house window. At the forge where August's fire was breathing again, but choosing to stop. That was still mine to choose. Nora looked at her for a long time. "Come to the office," she said. "Bring the records." Ruth came. They spent 4 hours going through documentation. Nora and Ruth and West, who turned out to have a head for figures that nobody had known about. Because nobody had thought to ask. Because he'd been doing odd jobs his whole life. And odd jobs required exactly the kind of practical arithmetic nobody noticed. None. Ruth walked them through every transaction, all of it. The legitimate purchases and the coerced ones, and the legal but wrong ones that were going to be the most complicated to unwind. The freight agreement that had strangled Callum Pratt's supply lines. The water rights clause that had let them reroute the creek access. The land documentation for the Henderson property, the paper trail going back 11 years. She was meticulous. Exhaustively, completely meticulous. Like a woman who had kept every receipt because she'd grown up with nothing and documents what stood between you and being told it never happened. Harriet arrived at noon, with food nobody had asked for. set it on the corner of the desk without comment, and left. They ate without stopping the work. By mid-afternoon, Nora had a complete picture, and it was complicated, not black and white. Not the clean story of pure predators and pure victims. Some of what the Vances had built was genuinely theirs. Some of it had consumed things it shouldn't have. The line between the two moved in ways that were going to require careful legal work to sort through properly. That was fine. That was what the law was for. She looked at Ruth across the desk. "You'll need to testify," Nora said, "when the investigator arrives. And at trial, I know, against your brothers." Ruth's jaw tightened. One small movement, the only one she allowed. "I know that, too." "Why? You already asked me that." "I'm asking again." Ruth looked at her. "Because it's the right thing. And I've spent a long time knowing the difference between right and legal and choosing legal." She paused. "I don't want to make that choice anymore." Nora looked at the papers spread across the desk. 3 years of what had happened to Broken Spur. The shape of it. What it was going to take to put it back. "There are things I can't promise you," she said. "About what the trial looks like. About sentencing, I'm not asking for promises. What are you asking for?" Ruth thought about it. "A real pause, not a performative one. That it goes through the process, the real one. Not," she gestured vaguely, "not the version of justice that happens in alleys when nobody's watching." "That's the only version I do," Nora said. Ruth nodded. "Once, like something resolved, that it had been unresolved for a long time." Day 16, Broken Spur, was quiet in the way of places that had been through something and were still deciding what it meant. People moved through their days with careful attention, like they were noticing things they'd stopped noticing. The width of the street, the sound of the forge, the way Callum Pratt stood in his doorway now. Upright, present. Like a man who had found something and was still surprised to be holding it. At the dry goods store, Bess Henderson stopped Nora on the boardwalk, her daughter's hand in hers. The little girl, 7 or 8, dark braids, serious eyes, was holding something. "Folded paper. Addie made you something," Bess said. Nora took the paper, unfolded it, crayon. The uncompromising bright crayon of a child who hadn't learned yet that colors needed to be subtle. A woman in black, tall on the page, with a yellow star on her chest, taking up approximately a third of her torso. Behind her, stick figures of varying heights. In front, shapes that were probably horses or possibly large dogs. It was genuinely hard to say. And above it all, in careful wavering letters, "The Sheriff of Broken Spur." Nora looked at it for a long moment. The spelling. The spelling was perfect in all the ways that mattered. "Thank you, Addie," she said. The girl looked at her with those serious eyes. "Are the bad men gone?" "The bad men are in a cell, and the law is coming in 5 days to make sure they stay accounted for." Addie considered this with the gravity of someone for whom 5 days was a significant portion of her remembered life. "Is that enough?" Nora thought about it. "It's a start," she said. Addie appeared to find this acceptable. She let go of her mother's hand, turned, and ran back into the store at the speed of someone who had completed an important mission and could now return to the rest of her life. Bess looked at Nora. "Thank you," she said, quietly. The way of people who meant it so completely that the words came out smaller than the feeling. Nora folded the drawing carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She went back to this office and pinned it to the wall behind the desk. "Sheriff of Broken Spur, right. Day 19, 5 days after the standoff." 1 day before the authorized investigator was due, Cord had been transferred to the county seat. 2 days before, under August's escort, to await proper facilities for trial. Lyle had gone with them. They'd left in the early morning, quietly, and the town had watched them go with the look of people who weren't celebrating. Just noting. Recording it somewhere internal, where it would stay. Ruth had remained in Broken Spur, not in a cell. She hadn't tried to leave. She came to the office each morning and continued the documentation work. Painstaking, thorough, the obsessive completeness of someone who needed to get it exactly right. She slept at the boarding house. She ate her meals, Most people didn't speak to her and she didn't push it, but nobody moved against her either. Harriet, when Nora noted this, shrugged. She rode in between her brother's gun and your head, she said. People remember things like that, even when they're not sure what it means yet. That evening, West knocked on the open door. Someone coming from the South Road. Government horse. Official tack. She stayed at her desk. The man who walked in 20 minutes later was 42, had been riding hard for 2 days, and was not in the ideal disposition for what he was about to find. He had an active federal commission. She could tell by the way he wore his badge, the particular confidence of a piece of metal backed by current paperwork, and the efficient manner of someone used to being in charge of any room he entered. He stopped when he saw her. Looked at the desk, the papers, the organized record of 20 days, the badge on her chest, Ms. Voss. I'm Investigator Harlan Cross. Territorial Federal Office, Mr. Cross. Sit down. There's a lot to go through. She gave him the summary. Quick, efficient, the Vance situation, the arson, the standoff, Cord and Lyle's current status, Roost's cooperation, the records. He listened without interrupting. You conducted this without an active commission, he said when she finished. Yes. Every arrest is documented with witnesses and evidence, sufficient for any competent court. The procedural question of my commission status is separate from the factual record of what occurred. She met his eyes. I expect you'll want to review the record before making any determinations. He picked up the first file. Started reading. She waited. He read for 2 hours. West brought coffee at some point, set it quietly on the corner of the desk, and left without being asked. When Cross set down the last file, the room was dark and the lamp was on. This is comprehensive, he said. It's what 20 days of work produces when you're not sleeping much. The procedural issue is real. Their lawyers will raise it, I know. Every arrest is technically challengeable. I know that too. He looked at her. The procedural challenges will fail, he said finally. This record is too clean. Their lawyers will spend 2 weeks looking for a crack, and they won't find one that matters. A pause, which you already knew. I was hoping. There's a difference, he almost smiled. The Vance woman. Ruth. You're vouching for her cooperation? I'm documenting it. There's a difference there too, he stood. Picked up the files. I'll need a formal statement from you tomorrow. Full account of every action from day one. He looked at her. And Ms. Voss, she waited. Whoever sent you here made a good choice. A pause. Even if you sent yourself, he left. She sat alone in the quiet. She looked at the wall behind the desk. At the crayon drawing. The sheriff of Broken Spur. The yellow star. The stick figures. The shapes that were horses or possibly large dogs. She looked at her hands on the desk. Still day 20. Cross was at Harriet's table when she came in with her coffee. He had papers. Of course he had papers. Everyone in this story had papers. He told her what she'd already begun to know from the way he was sitting and the way he wasn't quite meeting her eyes. The commission question. Regional Council reviewed the situation via telegraph last night. Their position is that any further official action you take needs to come under my authority. As for the actions already taken, the record stands. The evidence stands. The testimony stands. He paused. But your continued presence here in any official capacity represents a liability for the prosecution. If you remain as an active participant, their defense has grounds to argue the entire investigation was compromised from the start. She looked at her coffee. You need me to leave, she said. I need you to not be here in any official capacity. He looked at her. If you were to decide the situation was resolved and move on, as a private citizen who had been visiting, that would, I understand. Harriet at the stove was making deliberate noise with pots, the most purposefully irrelevant kitchen activity in the history of cooking. Cord and Lyle. Ruth, Nora said, we'll go to trial properly, fully, with everything you built. The record you created is the backbone of this case. None of that changes. A pause. Just your role in the final chapter. She stood. I'll have a formal statement on your desk by noon. Complete account of every action, every date, every decision. Written to be entered as evidence without requiring my testimony. That would be, I know what it would be. She picked up her coffee, stopped at the door. Cross. He looked at her. East Side Water Rights. Henderson family's original purchase. Documentation is in the third folder, third stack on the left. Ruth flagged it specifically. Make sure your office sees it before the property disposition hearing. I will, she went. She spent the morning writing. Every day. Every decision. Every conversation that mattered. Her own assessment of what she'd done, and why, and what had worked, and what hadn't, and what she'd known, going in that she wasn't authorized to do and had done anyway. All of it honest. Because if you were going to do a thing, you did it honest. Or you didn't do it at all. Later, at noon, she carried the statement to Cross's temporary office and left it on his desk without knocking. Then she went back to the investigator's office. Her office. 20 days, and it felt like somewhere she'd lived for years. West was there. He'd been waiting. He had his hands in his pockets and his hat on, and the face of someone who had heard things he wasn't supposed to hear, and was trying to arrange his expression around them. You're going, he said. I was always going. It just matters when. He looked at the floor. Not the old kind of floor looking. Just thinking, what do I do? When you're gone, she looked at him. Young man who'd been doing odd jobs and learning to look at the floor and had decided 3 weeks ago that this was what he wanted to do with his life. Who could shoot and keep records and think clearly under pressure, and had learned all of it faster than she had any right to expect. Cross's office will need a local liaison, she said. Someone who knows this town. The terrain, the people, the history of the past 3 years. She paused. I've already mentioned your name. He looked up. It's not the same as, no, but it's a start. She crossed to the desk, opened the drawer. The worn leather case she'd been carrying since Abilene. The documentation of 28 years, everything she'd been and done. She set it on the desk. Give that to Cross. He'll know what to do with it. West looked at it, back at her. And you, he said. What do you do? She looked out the window. At Broken Spur in the afternoon light. Repaired shutters on Callum Pratt's store. New boards going up on the Henderson storage. Someone had just started building this morning. The hammer sounds clear in the cold air. August's fire burning steady. The woman with the basket crossing the street at the same time she always did. Something that had never changed through any of this. I don't know yet, she said. Which was true. But I think I'm done running from places. That's new. He nodded. Someone filing something away for later. I'll walk you out, he said. You've got work to do. He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked at her face and made the smart choice. Goodbye, Ms. Voss. Goodbye, West. She watched him go, stood alone in the office. Looking at the desk and the empty bottle on the windowsill, and the 2 weeks of work in the filing cabinet, and the crayon drawing on the wall, that belonged here more than anywhere else she could think of. She unpinned the badge from her dress, set it on the desk, looked at it, then picked it up again and put it in her coat pocket because it was hers. Paper or no paper. Authorization or no authorization. 28 years of hers. And some things you kept not because you'd earned them on paper, but because they were the shape of what you'd been. And you didn't put that down just because someone told you the paperwork had lapsed. She picked up the leather bag, same bag she'd carried in, still light. Still not much changed on the outside. She walked out. Street was the street Broken Spur in late afternoon, long shadows stretching east. The smell of August's forge and someone cooking somewhere, and the particular clean smell of new wood going up where old wood had burned. She walked toward the south end of town, where her horse was boarded, where the road went out of the valley and toward everywhere else. She passed. Harriet's boarding house was on the porch. Not by accident, not pretending to be doing something else. Just standing there, watching. With those gray eyes that had never missed much, Nora stopped. They looked at each other. "Come back," Harriet said. Not a question, not quite a statement, somewhere between. The specific language of practical women who had decided something and saw no reason to dress it up. Nora looked at her. Probably, she said, which was not a promise, which was the most honest thing she could say right now. And Harriet Morse had spent enough years in this world to know that probably from someone who meant it was worth more than certainly from someone who didn't. Harriet nodded. Nora kept walking. She passed August's forge. He was working, didn't stop, but he looked up. And he did something she hadn't seen him do in 20 days. He raised his chin, one small precise gesture. The kind that men who had been soldiers made when words were less than what was needed and more would have been too much. She returned it. Kept walking, past Callum Pratt's store. He was in the doorway, said nothing, just watched. His being upright and present was everything any of them needed to say to each other. At the edge of town she stopped, looked back, broken spur in the long light. Worn buildings and repaired shutters, and new wood going up where old wood had burned. The forge breathing, the boarding house warm. People moving through their evenings with the posture of people who had remembered what upright felt like. 20 days, that was all. 20 days that were almost nothing and also everything. She looked at her hands, still not shaking. She turned and walked south. The evening came into the valley, the way evenings did in that country. Slow at first, then all at once, the light going golden, and then pink, and then the deep purple of high places. Before the stars started coming out one at a time, like witnesses arriving late. But arriving, she walked. Her boots on the road, and the valley going quiet around her, and somewhere behind her growing fainter, the sound of broken spur, settling into a night that was different from all the nights before it. Not fixed, not perfect, never perfect. The law was slow and the papers would take months, and Lyle's hand would heal, and Ruth would stand in a courtroom and say true things that cost her, and Cord would argue with lawyers about procedural questions in the water rights dispute, would go on long past anything she'd set motion. But, standing, broken spur was standing. She'd come here without authorization and stayed without permission, and built something out of 19 people's decision that they were done looking at the floor. And it was standing. It was standing right now. It would still be standing tomorrow. Thomas would have had something to say about it, the exact right words at the exactly wrong moment. Something that made her laugh when laughing seemed impossible. She thought the words toward him anyway. We did all right, she thought. For a dead man and a woman with a rusted badge and no legal standing whatsoever. We did all right. The stars were all the way out now. The valley was dark and quiet, and the road stretched south ahead of her, and she didn't know where she was going. Not yet. For the first time in a long time, not knowing felt different than it used to. It used to feel like falling. Now it felt like walking, just walking, into whatever came next, which was enough, which, it turned out, had always been enough. She kept walking. And for the first time in longer than she could honestly account for, she wasn't walking away from anything, just forward. Into the dark, into whatever tomorrow decided to be.